it be like to have your professional identity and existence deemed somewhat undefinable? Now, you might be wondering, where the heck are you going with this? Well, take today's guest. His name is Tim Romero, and for those that know him, or some people that know him, they might say that Tim is firmly within the world of entrepreneurship and startups. And they wouldn't be wrong. He's run several different companies, he's invested in a bunch more. Not only that, he runs the #1 Japan startup podcast out there. So yeah, entrepreneurship all the way. Well, on the other hand, those that know Tim might also say, no, this guy is corporate. He's within enterprise. And they'd have a strong case there. He's worked for a company you might be familiar with, Google. Yeah, he was head of Google Startups Japan. He's also worked for Japan's largest power utility, TEPCO, Zurich Insurance, and a bunch of other corporations as well. And those people saying, yeah, he belongs there, that's his identity, again, wouldn't be wrong. Well, the reason I bring all of this up is that today's episode represents this golden opportunity to kind of dive into both worlds. We can compare and contrast, we can show some of the differences, and I could not imagine a better guest to do all of this with than our guest today, Tim Romero. So I would like to jump into things, but before we do, I would encourage you to listen to the full-length audio version. There's just so much more contained within it, more than I can jam into these highlight videos, and you can find that wherever you access your podcast. Just do that search for Life as a ... All right, let's get into things. Okay, well, first up, probably the most sensible thing here to do is to break down the difference between a startup and an enterprise. So here's a clip of Tim doing just that for us.
The biggest difference between like a startup and an enterprise isn't scale, it isn't structure. It's that a startup's job is to search for that business model, to find it, to create it, to pivot 3 or 4 times to identify it, and to go bankrupt if they can't, which is what happens most of the time.
Yeah.
Whereas an enterprise, its job is to optimize a already defined business model.
Yeah.
And to scale it.
Yeah.
So they're fundamentally different creatures. And I mean, I've spent my career jumping back between the two of them.
Now, to reference how Tim closed out that last clip of how he's jumped back and forth between enterprise and also entrepreneurship and startups, I think this might be a nice sort of opportunity to learn a little bit more about what's guided some of these decisions. And I'll give you a hint, a bit of a spoiler here. Tim was not floating around and just sort of like jumping into this or jumping into that. There is definitely a method to a lot of the madness. So here's a clip of Tim kind of breaking that down for us.
Yeah, I think, well, there are two things. One, I think what I realized when I was really young, like when I was heading off to college, and another thing that kind of gelled with me in sort of my mid-30s. And just when I was heading off to college, I just did not want life to be boring. I didn't know exactly what I wanted exactly, but I just, and the vast majority of what I saw going on around me was just not interesting. And I just focused on things that I thought was interesting. I majored in physics because I thought it was interesting. I spent a lot of time on the road with my bands because I thought that was interesting. And I wasn't sure where anything was leading, but it was just something that I was interested in, passionate about. Yeah. And later on, and like I said, what gelled into my 30s is just sort of an extension of that. Finding something I wanted to do that added value to something, you know, that, and I don't necessarily mean add value in a save the world kind of value necessarily, although that's what attracted me to JERA is the decarbonization angle.
Absolutely.
But adding value in that, if you're building software, who's going to use it? What's the benefit? What's, you know, and that kind of directed which projects I undertook and which jobs I accepted.
Now, in speaking with somebody like Tim, who has this really diverse background, as I noted off the top, you know, it was a good opportunity to kind of dive into the weeds a little bit. And what I mean by this is I want to get centered in on this notion of innovation and kind of compare it and contrast. So what is innovation like within a startup as opposed to how it goes down within enterprise or corporate. And I think this is a really interesting sort of way of looking at companies and how they operate. So here's a clip of Tim kind of breaking that down for us. So check it out. Say within a big organization like that, when they do have that aim to create some sort of innovative project or program, what is it like working within that, within like the confines of that structure? But like you said, they have this aim to be innovative. They want to do these things. How does that experience contrast to that of just a straight startup that's off on its own?
Oh, I mean, it's the only place I think it really overlaps is in like the business model design, right?
Okay.
Where we were
Yeah.
trying to like create this new business model, and maybe in some of the relationships. Other than that, it's completely different.
Yeah. Now, in
Um,
what ways? Like, I'm trying to come from the perspective again of like a young listener here who doesn't have these experience, who doesn't have this added insight or background on either. How would you break that
well,
down even in simpler terms, maybe for somebody like that?
I'd say the biggest difference is in terms of the objectives. So if you're running a startup, the market is the ultimate arbiter of whether your idea is good or not. If you have customers, if they're willing to pay for it, you're doing okay. You're
Yeah.
doing something right,
Yeah.
no matter what anybody says, right? At a large company, you've got this different kind of mandate where you've got to introduce technology that complements the mission of the large company. There's a lot of internal politics because some people aren't. So everyone loves the idea of innovation in the abstract, but when it comes, yeah, people love innovation, but they hate change. So when it's like, okay, well, we need to change the way you're doing this, well, you're going to get pushback. And then you're back into the regular corporate um, politics with a small p,
Yeah.
where you're doing negotiations, you're doing, the usual corporate stuff.
Now, the full audio version of this conversation is fairly well balanced between entrepreneurship as well as enterprise. But this next clip here definitely does kind of sway over to the side of startup life. And in particular, this notion of reward or defining elements. And I just found that Tim's answer to this was incredibly insightful, and I just had to share it with you, despite it kind of leaning one way more than the other. So anyway, check it out. What would be some of the rewards of a life within a startup ecosystem that
Oh,
might go unnoticed or unchecked by some people?
I think the by far the most rewarding thing about it is, I mean, it can be very financially rewarding, and that's great. But
Yeah.
by far the most rewarding thing about it, I found, is that um, people using your creation. If you're
Mm,
building software and having customers say, "This is great. This has helped me run my business better," um, the kind of collaborative relationship you can have where they'll say, what about this? We're having this other problem, and just um, seeing that impact, at seeing that value, that direct connection is something you just absolutely cannot get at a large enterprise.
mm,
You just, there's too many moving pieces. But at a startup, everyone's involved in everything. There's just that wonderful connection to the customer. And,
yeah.
and I think that's one thing that people who've worked at an enterprise can never really understand. It's
Mm.
not innovation. It's not, they can get all that. The one thing that I don't think you can understand unless you've worked at a startup or a small business is what an incredibly valuable and precious thing a customer is.
It's the absolute lifeblood, right? Like,
Well, not just economically, but that too, definitely
yeah,
that too.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but like this kind of idea sharing, this kind of shared journey,
Mm,
I think that is far and away the most rewarding thing about running a startup, or even
mm.
being at a startup.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's another perspective I haven't heard as well. I think it's really an insightful one. Well, what would you say to the idea of like just the variety of work as well that you're involved in? Like you're wearing about a billion different hats probably early on, especially if you're starting it, one, two people, three people that are starting this venture.
Yeah,
You're getting your toes into just about everything.
if you are someone that enjoys learning and kind of diving into the deep end, yeah, startups are fantastic for that, because usually you're blazing a new trail, you're trying new things. It's a lot of responsibility very fast. Um, it is, quite frankly, you won't have the safety nets that you'll have at large organizations. Whereas, you'll have that responsibility, but it is responsibility.
Yeah.
So if you're working at, Unilever or Johnson and Johnson, and you're a marketer, and your campaign performs 40% below expectations. All right, that's bad. But you're not going to lose your job. You're not going to get demoted. It happens.
Yeah.
If your second campaign performs 40% below expectations, okay, you might get some additional training. People might look at you sideways. You're not going to lose your job. At a startup, not only will you lose your job, the whole company's going to go under because you won't have the revenues, you won't hit the next funding target. So it can get intense, but with the right team and the people who are focused, it's a lot like playing sports or playing in a band. And everyone is focused and working together, and everyone, when it works, everyone is willing to contribute ideas about anything, and that can be a whole lot of fun.
Well, I think we have time to squeeze in one more clip here. And on the heels of that last one on entrepreneurship, I'm going to give one more to you. Why? Well, hey, I do consider myself a man of the people. I like to give what people are after. And quite frankly, a lot of people are interested or at least curious about entrepreneurship. So I did have a question for Tim, which was centered on advice he'd be giving to somebody who was maybe a little bit apprehensive of that world, but still had an interest. So here's Tim's response, and I think it's a great one. So yeah, lean into it. And, on this program, I've spoken with a number of entrepreneurs, and oftentimes people say that right now is one of the best times to get into entrepreneurship. I mean, in terms of the amount of resources available, tools, just with AI alone these days. So the opportunities are there. But on the other hand, I mean, theoretically speaking, because of all this, I mean, the barriers to entry into this world of entrepreneurship seem to be a lot lower than ever.
Hmm.
And in that sense, maybe drives up the competition. I mean, these might be some ideas that young people would be considering or on the fence about. So if you had to give advice to someone who has some sort of interest in entrepreneurship, but still has some qualms about it based off some of the reasoning I just provided, what would you say to that person?
Um, I mean, I would agree with your previous guest that this is a fantastic time to be an entrepreneur, to be starting a company. I'd say that it is much more competitive than it's ever been, but that's
Yeah.
not necessarily a problem. I think that the acceptance, the willingness of both individuals and companies to try new technologies, the acceptance of startups as a viable alternative on both consumer and business side is much greater than before. So both the market side, both the supply and demand side are much larger. In
Mm,
terms of specific advice, I'd say um, don't chase trends. Don't try to do an AI startup if you're not an AI person, if you're not adding value to it. The other thing, I think the worst advice ever given and always given to founders is follow your passion. That's terrible advice. Don't do that. I was a professional musician. I was surrounded by very passionate people.
mhm,
I think passion passion doesn't lead to success. Success leads to passion. When
mm,
you are building something that your customers love and they're telling you love it and they love your creation, you become very passionate about it.
mm,
But if you only have passion, some parts of the journey are going to suck. There are going to be days that are just rough,
yeah.
and passion alone won't get you through it.
Mm,
So figure out where you add value,
mm,
right?
mm,
Figure out what you're doing that's making customers' lives better somehow.
mm.
So don't think so much about passion, think about adding value, and I think you'll be way ahead of the pack.
Well, this might be a nice point to wrap things up here, but as always, I do encourage you to check out the full-length audio version. For example, we dive into a day in the life of what Tim's involved with right now, which I might add, by the way, he's a partner at this climate tech fund, which is doing some absolutely amazing work within that space. We also get into some of his distinct experiences, for example, at Google and elsewhere. And you'll even be treated to this really, really interesting story that Tim shares also. So all up, I mean, this conversation is a great one. You're going to be treated to so much information on the entrepreneurial side as well as the enterprise side. So you can find this wherever you access your podcast. Just do that search for Life as a ... All right, that'll do it. We'll see you next week.